When you look at Pakistan's political history since its birth in 1947, it's a wild ride. It's been defined by this incredible, almost unbelievable pattern of instability right at the very top. And it all boils down to one central nagging question.
Seriously, think about that for a second. It sounds like a political brain teaser, right? But it's the absolute core mystery of Pakistan's democracy. For more than 75 years, the country's had this revolving door of leaders. And the reasons why, well, that's a story of some really deep-seated challenges that started from day one.
0. That's the number. Not a single elected leader has ever managed to finish their full 5-year term. And that's not just some trivia fact. It's the key that unlocks this whole cycle of crises we're about to dive into.
Okay, so to really get what's going on today, we have to rewind the clock all the way back to the beginning. That first decade after independence, it wasn't some smooth, easy transition. It was a frantic struggle just to survive and figure out what this new country was even supposed to be.
You know what's really wild about these early years? It took nine long years just to agree on the basic rules of the game. This whole period was just full of political infighting and even a constitutional coup where the whole assembly got dissolved. So when they finally did get a constitution in 1956, it was so fragile that it was completely tossed out just 2 years later when the military stepped in for the very first time.
And right at the heart of this whole constitutional mess was something called the Objectives Resolution. This was a document trying to do something really tricky, blend Islamic principles with Western-style democracy. It basically said, okay, ultimate power belongs to God, but the people's elected reps will be the ones to exercise it. This set the DNA for the country's identity, for sure, but it also baked in this really complex and often tense relationship between religion and state power right from the get-go.
So when you have all that political chaos in the first decade and no one can agree on anything, it leaves a huge power vacuum. And in Pakistan's history, one institution has always been there, ready and willing to fill that void: the military.
I mean, the instability was just off the charts. Get this, in the 2 short years between the first constitution and the first coup, 4 different prime ministers came and went. 4. This level of chaos basically handed the military the perfect excuse to step in and say, look, we're the only ones who can bring any stability around here. And that kicked off a cycle of intervention that would define the country for decades.
And this cycle gave us 2 really different but super impactful eras of military rule. First, you had Ayub Khan in the 60s. His whole thing was technocratic, top-down industrial growth. They called it the Great Decade. But that growth also made a tiny group of people incredibly rich. Then, a couple of decades later, you get Zia-ul Haq, who had a totally different playbook. He was all about the deep Islamization of everything: society, law, the economy. And you can still feel the effects of that today. Now, tucked between those 2 military dictatorships, there was a short return to democracy. But it was completely overshadowed by the trauma of the 1971 war, when East Pakistan broke away and became Bangladesh. This quote from Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto just perfectly captures the mood of the nation, this profound sense of vulnerability that fueled an obsessive drive to get a nuclear bomb no matter the cost. But as you can probably guess, this democratic period didn't last either. It ended with another coup.
After Zia's death in '88, Pakistan tried democracy again. But instead of getting stability, the country stumbled into this decade-long slugfest between 2 powerful political families. It was like watching a political tennis match, with power swinging back and forth and back and forth. And this basically became the blueprint for the entire decade. First Benazir Bhutto, then Nawaz Sharif, then Bhutto again, then Sharif again. Neither of them ever got close to finishing a term before they were kicked out, usually on charges of corruption, and often with the military establishment pulling the strings behind the curtain. And how did this decade of so-called democratic hope end? You guessed it, another military coup.
So that brings us into the 21st century, and you're going to see the faces might change, the details might be a little different, but the fundamental pattern of unfinished terms and constant instability, it feels eerily familiar.
Under General Musharraf's military government after the '99 coup, the economy actually boomed for a while. A lot of this was fueled by international aid money pouring in after 9/11. But here's the thing, that growth wasn't built to last. So the democratic governments that came after him inherited a total mess: energy shortages, mountains of debt, which made their job of actually governing almost impossible.
And if you think this is all ancient history, think again. The cycle literally just repeated itself. In 2022,
Prime Minister Imran Khan was booted out of office in a no-confidence vote. He became just the latest leader unable to finish his term, and it plunged the country right back into that familiar chaos of political turmoil and protests.
So, okay, after seeing this pattern play out over and over and over again, it becomes pretty clear the problem isn't just about this leader or that leader. It's about these deep, structural fault lines that have been shaking the country from the very beginning.
When you boil it all down, you can trace this constant instability back to a handful of chronic problems that no government seems to be able to fix. There's the constant struggle with debt, a weak legal system that scares off investors, an economy that buys way more than it sells, and powerful elite groups who rig the system for themselves. And simmering underneath it all is that constant, unresolved power struggle between the civilian government and the army.
And this right here, this is the fundamental trap at the heart of Pakistani politics. It's a vicious cycle. Economic problems make people angry, which leads to political chaos. But that same chaos makes it impossible for any government to stick around long enough to make the tough, painful reforms needed to actually fix the economy. It's a political doom loop that has caught every single leader for decades.
Which brings us to the final billion-dollar question. With a history defined by these unfinished terms and endless crises, the real challenge isn't just about who wins the next election. It's about whether the country's democratic system can ever become strong enough to finally, once and for all, break the cycle.